Ex-soldier and his dog found a hidden bunker on his land. Entered it, and his life was never the same. Wind didn't just howl. It spoke in broken syllables through the pines, as if the coast remembered a night it swore never to repeat. Caleb Morrow killed the porch light and let darkness settle like a visor. Somewhere below, the Atlantic tore itself into white tatters. Shadow froze, nose cutting the air, then launched downslope with a bark he hadn't used since combat. Urgent, specific, final. Caleb followed, boots punching into sodden turf, every gust throwing needles like shrapnel. The ground trembled, a root web split, and a buried circle blinked awake in the muck. Dark steel, rain beating on it like sweat. A recessed handle stamped with a tiny trident, and a number he knew wasn't random. He wiped mud with his sleeve, the stenciling bled through. MN42, and beneath it a scuffed warning triangle. Not U.S. standard, not Navy, not civilian. From the pit's rim something tapped, soft, regular, impossible, like a knuckle on a distant pipe. Once, twice, pause. 3 fast. Shadow's hackles lifted. He stared at the seam where metal met earth as if waiting for it to answer back. Caleb pressed his ear to the hatch. Through wind and surf he caught a low hum. Not the sea, not the house. Electrical, faint as a held breath. He slid his fingers under the handle, cold bit bone. The steel didn't budge. The next lightning flash lit the underside of a torn root. Someone had carved into it years ago. 3 initials, cross-hatched, plus a date worn down to 66. His grandfather's last name began with N. So did 2 others in the town's oldest stories. The ones people stopped telling when kids got old enough to ask real questions. Shadow whined, not fear, impatience. Above them, the sky split again. Caleb tasted iron in the rain, and a decision on his tongue. If he opened this, the quiet life he'd been faking would end. He tightened his grip anyway because something below was still humming, and it knew his family name. Dawn found the bluff raw and glaring, the kind of morning that pretends at peace because the night already took what it wanted. Caleb Morrow woke before any alarm, listened to the roof tick back into place, and tasted brine lingering like a warning that refused to leave. He crossed the narrow hallway, where photographs leaned at slight angles, each tilted by storms and neglect, and paused in a kitchen that smelled of old coffee, linseed oil, and seawater. The 2-story clapboard house had lived through more winters than he had deployments, its cedar shingles silvered to the color of a gull's back, its porch sagging in a gentleman's bow that suggested patience rather than surrender. He brewed a fresh pot, took the enamel mug in both hands, until the heat steadied them, and opened the back door on air as cold and damp as a soaked bandage. Shadow rose without sound and padded after him, a dark shape alive with attention, ears lifted, breath visible. The yard looked punched. Branches lay everywhere, some stripped to pale spears, others tufted with shredded needles. A ribbon of shingles glittered near the steps. The fence along the east edge had folded where the big white pine had fallen. Rails cracked, posts twisted, pickets chewed. Beyond that wreckage, the land sloped toward the Atlantic, a scatter of rock and scrub pushing against gray water that still lunged and sulked. Between house and bluff, the ground gaped where the tree had torn free. The pit looked surgical, a delta of mud sliding inward, roots splayed like ribs, damp loam, breathing cold. Caleb felt last night's jolt return, lightning's hard flash, wind like a turbine wash, Shadow's bark taking on that clipped cadence that meant urgent, specific now. He set the mug on a flat stone and climbed toward the crater with the measured economy that never left him. Syria sat behind his eyes, the way bright after images hang there when you have stared too long at an explosion. There were mornings when he woke convinced he could still smell hot dust, cordite ghosts, and burned oil hiding beneath ordinary things. The house's hum, the sea's pull, and Shadow's steady presence kept those edges dull, most days. Today they sharpened. He crouched at the rim. The metal he and Shadow had uncovered during the worst of the wind lay half-revealed, a round plate with a recessed handle, rain-dried to smudged freckles. He ran a thumb across its face. Rough, grainy, older than the fence, younger than the house, not marine hardware, not municipal, something private and deliberate. Last night in the surge and chaos, he had thought he felt a hum through the handle, faint as a held breath, Imagination maybe. He leaned in again. Nothing moved. Only the ocean did its old work. Shadow pointed his nose down the slope, inhaled deliberately, then glanced back for a command. Caleb slid into the pit. Clay sucked at his boots. Mud climbed his cuffs. Roots brushed his shoulders, cool and slick, a tangle knitting the hole with stubborn stitches. Up close, the plate revealed a narrow arc of corrosion that traced a partial ring around the handle. He scraped with a stick, then with his nails, prying out grit, freeing a shallow notch that might once have held a safety pin or lock. His knuckles wore a film of rust in seconds. The smell rose sharp and metallic, riding the damp. The handle lifted a fraction and stopped. He didn't force it. He let his palm rest and listened. Wind threaded the torn grove. Far off, a buoy bell tolled through the flood's leftover heave. No, only the drum of his own heart and the quiet message of effort arriving at a wall. He eased back, set the stick aside, and looked for anything else. A narrow seam along the west edge of the cavity ran straighter than soil usually allows. He pressed there. The clay felt smoother, like a patch troweled and forgotten. Shadow shifted to that side and pawed once. No bark, no fuss, only insistence. Caleb dug with fingers and found a thin rod buried alongside the hatch, a line to vanish into the dark where the seam continued. The rod flexed slightly and snapped back. He followed it until his fingertip found a short length that turned like a small valve stem. He tried it gently. It resisted, then grudgingly rolled a quarter turn. A narrow thread of brown water bled into the clay. The smell changed from mere iron to old dust, paper, locked air that remembered faces. He looked up at the house, at the broken fence, at chores that could hold his hands for hours if he let them. He almost climbed out to mend something simple and postpone the complicated. He turned the stem another quarter. No hiss, no click, only the subtle give of something that had waited behind roots and years. He sat back on his heels and wiped mud on his jeans. His grandfather's handwriting crossed his mind. Those steady ledgers he had found after the funeral, columns so neat they looked printed, numbers squared off like soldiers standing inspection. Stories in town had named the old man cautious, thrifty and stubborn when it served him, kind when he remembered. Nobody had called him secretive, not in word. Yet the bluff held a hatch under a family tree, and the hinge of that thought turned with a quiet that raised the hair along Caleb's arm. He pulled himself out of the pit and walked the yard once, like a perimeter, scanning the approach from the road, sightlines through the spruce, coverage from the porch, reflexes mapping the theater without instruction. He hated that he did it automatically, and loved how useful it remained. He fetched a pry bar, a coil of rope, work gloves, and a battery lamp from the shed that still smelled of fuel and varnish. He checked knots the way he checked breathing under fire, carefully. He anchored the rope to the pine's battered stump, and lowered the lamp into the hole until light washed the plate. The metal took on a dull sheen. Near the handle, faint and almost swallowed by corrosion, two stamped characters emerged when light struck at the right angle. And family initials lived inside those letters. Yet the mark felt bigger than a surname's coincidence. He tested the handle again. It moved just enough to prove it wanted more leverage. He set the pry bar's bite under the lip, braced his feet, and leaned. The plate groaned. He stopped before sound turned reckless. He never forced doors he hadn't fully read. He climbed out and sat on the rim with the lamp off, letting the landscape return, allowing his mind to slow until details arranged themselves into something he could trust. The fence needed straightening. The porch needed new fasteners. The flattened garden would welcome a rake and quiet work. He could pick any simple task and breathe inside it until dusk. Shadow pressed against his shin and looked into the pit with a steadiness that felt like instruction. Caleb rested a hand between the dog's shoulder blades and felt assurance under fur and heat. "We'll get there," he said softly, surprised by the sound of his own voice. He ran contingencies without drama. If the hatch hid an old fallout shelter, it might be flooded or unstable. If it connected to something larger, he would need help. Maybe the sheriff, maybe the county, maybe no one, until he knew what waited. If it proved private and harmless, he could seal it and let decades keep their own counsel. He stood and took a slow walk to the cliff's edge. The Atlantic wore the storm's aftermath in long bands of broken foam. Gulls dragged low arcs over the water. The horizon had that narrow strip of paler gray, that meant the sun existed somewhere beyond refusal. He breathed in salt and the mineral scent of disturbance, and let the air cut through whatever the night had left behind. On the way back, he knelt at the crater again, examined the rod, the stem, the stamped letters, the notch he had cleared, and the faint difference in soil that marked a once intentional boundary. He thought of questions that never received real answers when he was young. Why did the old man keep that locked chest? Who were the men who visited some summers and spoke on the porch at dusk in voices that slid off hearing, then left before anybody learned their name? Why did the family stop saying certain surnames after a church picnic, ended in whispered arguments, and a broken headlight? He had told himself memory makes mysteries larger than they ever were. He had told himself a soldier should leave ghosts where they lie. Shadow's ears flicked. The dog lowered his head and breathed at the seam again, tail raised, attention narrow. Caleb touched the handle one more time and let go. He would not open anything alone on a morning like this. He would stabilize the yard, patch the fence, document what he could, and return with the calm that comes after preparation. Still, as he collected tools and coiled the rope, unease slid under his ribs, and settled there, not panic, not dread, an alertness that sharpened thoughts the way a whetstone kisses steel. Somewhere beneath his feet, a decision made by other hands waited inside iron and soil, patient as a tie. He had inherited a house, a dog, a view, and a problem shaped like a circle. Shadow looked up, met his eyes and held them. Caleb nodded, as if the dog had spoken. Work first, then the truth. Caleb returned at noon with a pry bar, a crowfoot wrench, and the steadiness that comes after choosing caution over impulse. Wind fell to a restless breath along the bluff, leaving the air metallic and rich. Shadow trotted close as he slid into the crater, lamp clipped to his collar, rope tied to the pine stump. The hatch waited like a closed eye, under a crust of clay. He swept the seam clean, seated the bar, checked his stance, and leaned with measured pressure. Old iron answered with a long throat sound. The handle rose a notch, halted, and rose again when he shifted leverage. A draft crept from below, cool and stale, with the sweetness of paper sealed too long. He paused, let the breath of the place pass over his face, and listened. No water moved, no small life skittered. Only the Atlantic, working its patient arithmetic against the rock. He lifted. The plate tipped and settled against a brace of roots, like a lazy lid. A square shaft opened, lined with concrete and a fixed ladder of iron rungs, sunk into the wall. He sent the lamp beam into the void, and found dust dancing like slow snow. He shook the nearest rung. It held with a gritty complaint. He looped the rope through the top rung, tied off with a figure 8.5 hitch, and tested with his weight. "Stay," he told Shadow, then clicked a code that meant wait and watch. The dog planted himself at the rim, ears cut to the hole, eyes tracking every move. Caleb stepped onto the ladder, rust powdered his palms, and the cold bit through his sleeves. He went down one careful rung at a time, until his boots found a concrete floor. He angled the lamp. A bunker resolved. Low ceiling, poured walls feathered by formwork lines, a foldable steel cot strapped against one side, a pegboard with hooks like punctuation, a desk with 2 drawers, and a run of shelves anchored to bracket. A radio chassis without its case sat under the desk beside a tangle of wire, as if someone had intended to repair it and had run out of patience or days. Moisture had not flooded the room. The floor was dusty, the air dry and sour, the temperature cellar cool. Shadow's collar jingled above. Caleb called once, and the dog descended in a deliberate rhythm, testing each rung with a paw before committing. When Shadow reached the floor, he circled once and leaned against Caleb's knee, then moved ahead with his nose low, drawing a slow match. Caleb set the lamp on the desk and tested the drawers. The top stuck and then gave. Inside lay a pad of yellow note paper, fused at the edges, a fountain pen gone brittle, and a key with a small brass tag stamped TN. The second drawer held a folded oilcloth, 3 blank index cards wrapped in string, and a box of nails. On the shelves a coffee tin rattled with screws. A mason jar held a desiccant packet that had burst into chalk, and an army surplus ammo box waited, without marking. He lifted the box, and felt the weight that promised contents. The latch yielded with a dry click. Inside lay a leather journal bound with twine. The knot broke like a twig. The cover, dark and burnished at the corners, carried a faint stamp on the inside. Thomas Morrow. Caleb's thumb paused on the name the way a tide hesitates at the lip of a rock pool. His grandfather had been exact, thrifty and quiet in ways that felt like gates more than virtues. Caleb eased the first page open. The handwriting ran neat, upright, and confident. The early entries read like maintenance, weather, fence repair, seed orders, deliveries, and names of men who came by the house and left before supper. Then the tone shifted without warning. Met with partners. One line said, "No date, only a pencil tick in the margin. Agreement in force, signatures deferred." Another read, "Project box transferred to lower room. Access by key only. Record kept off-site. A week later, data sent recorded. Insists funds will be safe if kept below." Caleb looked around the bunker, as if the letters had changed the light. He swept the beam over the shelves again. Empty gaps now felt like statements instead of neglect. Shadow breathed a low rumble, not warning, more like a question. Caleb rested a hand between the dog's shoulders, and kept reading. Asset titled through intermediary. Papers to reflect MN designation, until completion, Thomas had written. The letters MN pricked him with memory of the hatch stamp. A later page noted a purchase of a reel-to-reel machine from a shop in town. Payment in cash, receipt kept by Ella. Another line written smaller, said storage cavity prepared west wall. He crossed to the shelves and felt along the wall with the backs of his fingers. Concrete chilled the skin. At shoulder height, a hairline seam ran vertically. He tapped. The sound changed from hard to shallow. A hidden panel. He set the journal down, used the pry bar with restraint, and drew the panel outward on pins he could not see. A recess the size of a suitcase waited in the wall, dry and undisturbed. Inside lay a folded tarp, a packet wrapped in waxed cloth, and a small wooden crate fastened with tiny tacks. He placed the packet on the desk and undid the string. Within, a stack of envelopes bore dates from the mid-60s, addressed to a shell company he did not recognize. Receipts listed equipment, fuel, lumber, and a safe deposit rental. A single page in Thomas's hand said, "Hold until we decide if honor outlives need." He opened the crate and found spools of quarter-inch tape, labeled by month, and a brass nameplate engraved with Elias Navarro, a name that meant nothing yet moved the air anyway. He did not load the tape. Not. He returned to the journal as if it had turned hot and needed to be handled without wasting time. Entries contracted into fragments. Lel wants disclosure. M pushes timelines. Risk accepted by silence. Keep the key hidden in the desk until spring. One page carried 3 initials with no verbs at all. T. L. M. The next line, in smaller letters, said, "No one else." Caleb felt his unease gather mass. Not panic, but the weight of a shape you can sense in darkness before you see the outline. He turned the book sideways to examine the gutter. Something had been glued under the back-end paper. He worried the edge until it lifted, then coaxed free a thin slip covered with coordinates, and a simple compass rose. Beside the rose Thomas had scratched west wall cavity 1, and below that, cavity 2 upon completion, mark with nail head. He checked the panel frame, and found a brad sunk deep, hammered flush, bright under dust, where something had brushed it recently, or perhaps the air had kept it from dulling. Shadow's tail gave a slow lift. The dog pressed close, alert without sound, eyes reflecting the lamp like twin coals. Caleb read a final cluster of lines that felt less like notes and more like a man arguing with himself. Promises written under pressure, bind nothing worth keeping. The boy will not carry this if I can finish. L says truth waits like a time. Mem works with figures as if people were columns. The last entry carried no date, and ended mid-sentence. If we move before the thaw, the bluff will. The ink trailed into a scratch where the pen had broken. He closed his eyes and saw his grandfather at the same desk upstairs, winter light on the ledger, silence like a rule. He opened his eyes and saw the fallout shelter instead, a room built against fear, stocked once, used briefly, then folded into secrecy. He laid the journal flat, placed a palm on the cover, and felt the faint texture of the stamped name, as if it could warm under touch. His voice did not carry far in the dense air, but he heard himself anyway. Have you ever found something that changed how you see your past? The question belonged to anyone who had opened a door expected to lead nowhere, and found a map instead. No answer rose, only the hum of his own blood and the small creaks of a structure adjusting to breath and memory. He set the tape crate back into the recess, returned the packet, and swung the panel into place, until the seam hid itself again. He left the journal on the desk a moment longer, light falling across the leather like a thin Then he slipped it inside his coat as if warming it could prevent what came next from feeling colder. He checked the ladder, the rope, the climb and the sky above, rehearsing the exit, as if the room might change while his back was turned. Shadows stood ready. Caleb killed the lamp for a count of 3 to let sound and smell fill in what sight could not. The dark held only the honest odors of dust and iron. He raised the beam again, scanned for anything he had missed, and found a single nail head glinting on the west edge near the floor, exactly where the coordinate slip had hinted more would be one day. Not today. He had had enough for one descent. He touched the cold wall, nodded to the animal, and reached for the first rung. Above, the open hatch framed a pale rectangle of afternoon, the ocean beyond it restless but no longer enraged. The climb felt longer on the way out, as climbs do when you carry weight that does not show. At the rim, Shadow scrambled free and turned, poised to pull if needed. Caleb emerged into the raw light with the journal closed, the bunker sealed behind him for the hour it would take to find courage and return with more light, more questions, and the patience that follows a door that has finally told the truth of existing. He turned the page and felt the room lean closer. The knock came just after the tide turned, 2 quick taps that cut through the wind and the faint metallic echo still living in Caleb's hands, from the hatch. He opened to a woman in a rain shell beaded with spray, hair pulled into a practical knot, eyes the watchful gray of the coast. She introduced herself with classroom clarity and field grit. Nora Blake, historian, 30, researching her grandfather, and the name struck flint against stacks of old town stories he had never bothered to file. Before he could answer, she drew a zip bag from her satchel and offered a sepia photograph sealed in cloudy plastic. 3 men in winter coats standing in front of this house, when the clapboards were brighter and the porch stood straight, snow stacked on the rail like folded sheets. Thomas Morrow held a cigarette and stared past the lens, as if listening to something behind the camera. Leonard Blake stood beside him, hat tipped, mouth almost smiling, eyes not even close. The third man had a square jaw and a guarded lift to his shoulders, identified on the back in neat fountain pen as Marcus Hale. "My grandmother kept this," Nora said. "My mother wouldn't let it hang in the living room. She said the picture invites weather." A gust shouldered the porch, and the bell tapped wood once, as if to agree. Caleb stepped aside. She entered with measured movement, shook rain from her cuffs, set the photograph on the kitchen table, and laid a folder beside it, with the respect of someone placing evidence. "A partnership agreement," she said, unfastening a brass clip, "executed in 1965 with addenda in 66. It references an asset held on this property, under a provisional designation. It sunsets at the end of this season, unless heirs present claims with supporting material." Paper that had slept for decades breathed out a scent of bank vaults and lemon oil. The signatures lined the bottom like a quiet parade. Thomas Morrow, Leonard Blake, and in a heavier hand, Marcus Hale. Caleb read the clause naming his land as the situs for secure storage, and felt the morning narrow to a point. The ink had browned, but the words carried their own weather. He set the page down without letting go. "Why bring this now?" She glanced through the window at the flattened fence, the sheared branches, the raw band of mud where the giant pine had torn free. "I've chased ledger fragments for a year," she said. "A December gale uprooted a pine, the week my grandfather visited this house in 60. Last night's storm looked like a rhyme. Patterns return." Shadow padded in and stopped 2 steps from her, posture erect, tail still, nose working. Nora let the dog decide. After a beat, he accepted a cautious scratch behind the ear, then posted by Caleb's leg as if to mark custody. Her gaze ticked from Caleb's mud-bitten cuffs to the gray line of rust on his palm. "You found something," she said. Not a question. He weighed the room, the photo, the folder, the surf drawing hard on its leaf. He poured coffee, passed her a mug, kept his own near the heat, then said, A hatch, under the fallen tree. Her face changed the way faces change, when a long suspicion landed. She slid out a carbon copy of an equipment list that named radio parts, shelving brackets, and a steel door labeled Civil Defense Surplus. The operative passages use initials for the partners, she said. T, L, M. I can account for T and L. Caleb looked at the photograph again. Marcus Hale's jaw seemed carved from refusal. Initials no longer felt theoretical. He thought of the leather journal in his coat, the panel in the west wall, the brass plate engraved with a stranger's name, waiting in dust. Nora watched him think like she was watching a storm line form. I didn't come to take anything, she said. I came to learn whether my grandfather fixed his name to something that never belonged to him. The sentence sounded rehearsed and hard-won. Caleb fetched the journal from the hook where he had hung it in a careless copy of Calm and set it on the table, without pushing it closer. She didn't reach. It lay between them like neutral ground. Outside the wind rose and let go, rose again, scraping the eaves with twig fingers. Before I open that, he said, tell me what the agreement means by provisional designation. She traced a clause with one finger. They held title through an intermediary, while arranging a transfer that kept their names off the first filings. They used a mark instead of a company name. The typed parenthetical beside the clause read MN. This tag repeats across receipts, she said. Caleb felt those letters catch like grit under skin. He had seen them stamped under corrosion on the hat. He had read them in his grandfather's careful note, with a calm that now sounded like secrecy, pretending not to be heard. I saw those letters, he said, on the metal. Nora met his eyes without blinking. She breathed once, then said, Marcus died in 70. His son Victor has been buying claims he thinks relate to this agreement. If he believes expiration gives him room, he'll take it. A black SUV prowling back roads flashed through Caleb's mind like an omen he refused to keep. Nora lifted an open hand. If there's a hidden asset here, and if Leonard helped bury truth with it, I need to know, she said. He was meticulous, but he could be steered by men who called greed prudent. Caleb opened the journal to the line that read, Partners met, agreement in force, then turned the page so she could read without lifting it. Her gaze moved like a scanner across neat lines, until it halted at the initials. L for Leonard, she said softly. M for Marcus. T for Thomas. No one else. He showed her the note about the storage cavity, and coordinates. West wall, she murmured, as if taking dictation from a room. The look that followed was not hunger, it was disciplined curiosity, the kind that learns to. Have you ever met someone who turned your world upside down? She asked suddenly, then gave a small self-aware smile. Research does that to me on the good days. Families do it on the rest. The question landed like a gloved hand, opening a door. Caleb felt a corner of his guard ease, not surrendering, shifting from combat to conversation. He poured more coffee. She wrapped her fingers around the mug, warming hands that had rifled cold archives. If we treat this like a dig, he said, we go layer by layer. No assumption, no sudden moves. Agreed, she said. You document, I corroborate. Shadow settled at their feet as if rules soothed him. Caleb described the ladder, the shelves, the desk, the radio chassis, the ammo box and the leather itself. He did not name the tapes, only the suggestion of recorded truth folded away like winter. She winced at the hint and let it pass. If Victor appears, she said, we show the agreement and call the sheriff. Daniel Reed is not fond of people who translate threats into property language, Caleb said. Thunder rippled offshore, as if the storm had kept a pocket of temper. He gathered the folder, the photograph and the journal, locked the door out of habit, and led her across the yard toward the crater, where roots held the earth in a rictus. She paused at the rim, absorbing scale. Whoever planned this was thinking long, He tied a fresh loop around the stump and tested it. Shadow waited at the lip. Caleb cracked the hatch. Old paper breathed out again, threaded with iron. He clipped the lamp, started down, and Nora followed without a flinch, boots sure on the run. On the floor she turned one quiet circle, as if the bunker were a clock, testing her sense of time. Textbook civil defense, she said, and then someone rewrote the lesson plan. He set the journal on the desk, and opened it to entries she had not seen. Her mouth thinned at the line about risk accepted by silence. He showed her the seam and the recess. She studied the panel like a surgeon reading a scar that hides both skill and harm. This isn't hoarding, she said. It's choreography. They inventoried without touching more than necessary. She recorded dates from envelopes, photographed label edges, and noted dust patterns, as if absence could testify. When they finished, they stood under a ceiling that made whispers feel louder than declaration. Those initials aren't just a code, she said. They're a promise that never learned how to end. Caleb listened to the room, breathed, and knew solitude had given way to a cautious alliance drawn by need and tempered by weather. On the climb back up, Shadow went first, steady as a rope. Above them, the afternoon darkened. Rain returned in thin needles. Waves pressed harder against the rock. On the porch, Nora tucked the photograph away and buckled her satchel. If Victor calls, I'll be here when he arrives. Until then, we read, verify, and remember that families often hide the truth because they think love can't survive it. Caleb nodded, not to agree with everything, but to mark the work's new shape. The bell rang twice like a measure. The house adjusted around the idea of the company. The storm had not finished. Neither had the gravel whispered along the drive, a sound that didn't belong to Mail or neighbors. Caleb and Nora shared a look that put caution ahead of questions and stepped onto the porch as a black SUV rolled from the trees. Paint wet with mist, it stopped by the flattened fence. Engine idling, windows black. Victor Hale exited with deliberate ease. Late 30s, composed and expectant. Two larger men followed, scanning yard and sea like surveyors with orders. Victor took in the crater, the rope, the broken pine, and smiled like a claim had already cleared title. Mr. Morrow, he said, voice smooth. You've uncovered an asset that belongs to my family. Caleb stayed still. Shadow moved ahead and planted himself at the path, hackles rising, a note in his chest that ended other men's choices. Nora stood at Caleb's shoulder, folder in hand, photograph secure beneath. This land is Caleb's, she said. Storms uncovered what was buried here. Victor's men started toward the pit. Shadow's growl tightened the shorter man's step to nothing. Victor lifted his palms to show reason. No one wants trouble, he said. We want what's ours. My father and his father paid for that asset. It was stored here, not given. Caleb answered with quiet authority. Show documentation to the sheriff. Victor's smile thinned. The sheriff can read, he said. But he can't alter the agreement. It expires soon. If I'm not in possession, damages escalate. Nora opened the partnership paper so the wind couldn't tear it. Signed by 3 men, she said, not by heft with muscle. Victor nodded at the crater. Open it, he told his men. We'll inventory together. The taller one shifted. Shadow issued a low, iron warning that stopped him clean. Caleb took 1 step down the path, posture translating into law. You don't cross my line, he said. You don't touch my dog. Victor walked a few paces toward the porch, feigning admiration for the view. I'm not your enemy, he said. Our grandfathers were partners. Their project created value. Reasonable people share. Nora's reply carried winter. Reasonable people don't arrive with intimidation. Thunder grumbled offshore. Victor ignored it. I want the briefcase, he said, too specific for chance. I want the papers, the reels, the ledger. Keep the bunker if you love the view. Caleb kept his face quiet over the memory of a leather journal and a recess in the west wall. You've been listening to ghosts, he said. Victor's patience frayed. Doors don't stay quiet for 60 years. Bankers remember deliveries. A technician remembers a radio. I'm here to collect what should never have been hidden. The shorter man's hand hovered near his jacket. Caleb said, almost gently. Lift it and the sheriff will find it empty before you do. Nora set her phone to record on the table by the window. Victor noticed and disliked the blinking dot. He turned to the ocean without smiling. You know chain of custody, he said. The asset is ours. Caleb's reply cut cleaner. Chain of custody includes the chain that binds men to deeds. Victor faced him then. I'm not my father, he said, but I will enforce what he signed. If you force escalation, I'll be thorough. He glanced at Nora and the dog. This bluff gets lonely after dark. Shadow bared a measured inch of tooth. The taller man's tough line died on his tongue. Nora stepped down 1 stair. Leave now, she said. Return with a court order. Victor tasted her surname. Blake, Your grandfather was clever. He wouldn't want his legacy chained to a hermit and a librarian. Historian, she said. Thunder rolled closer. The SUV idled like a threat. Victor let the polite mask fall. I'll be back, he said. Inventory is coming with me, one way or another. His men retreated with those half-turns that refused to show a back to a dog. Gravel hissed. The vehicle slid into the trees. The house exhaled. Caleb stood listening until the engine was only wind. Shadow's coat settled under his hand. Nora eased a breath and set the document down. The Atlantic worked the ledges. Rain ticked from bows. He knew about the briefcase, she said. He won't stop at words. Caleb pictured Victor buying allies and angles, then saw the bunker's west wall and the panel seam like a ruler. The assets are in the bunker, Nora said. It has to be. He didn't disagree. Every line in Thomas's notes bent inward. The house seemed to lean toward the crater. We move it, Caleb said. We document and remove what can be carried, and we alert the sheriff, Nora said. If he returns tonight, we need siren. Caleb checked the windows and latched the back door, then watched the path until only the wind moved. What would you protect, no matter the cost? He asked, and the room held the question like evidence. Nora didn't hesitate. Truth, she said, and the Shadow thumped his tail once. They gathered rope, batteries, a second lamp, a tarp and a lockbox. The sky bruised. Thunder massed. From the road no sound. From the sea, a steady insist. They tied the rope with redundancies that pleased both of them and lowered the light until the concrete learned their names. The bunker breathed a cold, stored smell. They descended, Shadow careful, Nora precise, Caleb steady. The room received them. Shelves waited. The desk kept its reserve. The west wall watched like a closed eye. They looked at each other, knowing the next move would alter every later conversation. Above, wind hunted the eaves, and the bluff held its line against water and time, but the house had chosen a side, and so had they. Caleb set the journal on the table, and found the line that read risk accepted by silence. Daniel Reed will come if I call. He dislikes men who turn threats into paperwork. Nora checked sightlines from the road. We staged the house, she said. Lights on, curtains angled, evidence upstairs. If he returns he meets witnesses, not opportunity. Shadow breathed at the window like a stand. Caleb unlocked a cabinet, checked the pump shotgun and set it aside. Paper before powder, he said. But he won't make our choices. Nora phoned the sheriff, filed the encounter, and kept the call long enough to turn a note into a record. She drew a map of exits and dead ground a deputy would trust at midnight. Wind rattled the bell. The light went pewter. They moved without a rush. In the bunker they wrapped documents in a tarp, taped it tight, and passed the bundle up the ladder. Gravity tugging. They stowed it under the attic eave behind dusty jars, then returned for the crate they feared. Caleb rested a hand on it, and felt history change weight. No playback tonight, he said. Not with headlights ahead. We listen when law stands in the doorway. Nora. They checked batteries, tightened knots, rehearsed the climb with empty boxes, until motion settled into muscle. When they paused, only the dog's breath and the sea remained, steady as a metronome. Thunder signed its name again, closer now, and the house squared its shoulders. Night cinched tight around the bluff, a pressure that made the clapboard house mutter in its joints. Inside, under a brass lamp, Caleb and Nora opened Thomas Morrow's leather journal, as if disarming a device. Shadow lay between them, and the back door, ears working, breath measured, every gust from the Atlantic, nudging the bell against wood. The bunker's cold had climbed the ladder with them. Iron and paper lingered in the air, a cellar thread that refused the stove's warmth. Nora squared the spine and drew a timeline from the first clipped entries to the last fractured line where ink bit and failed. Dates stitched winters to budgets. Initials stood where names should have stood. Short phrases repeated until a pattern surfaced like grain under varnish. Caleb found a tiny compass rose hidden under the back-end paper, and a terse string 20 in 6E. W1. Cavity. Nora read it softly, then tapped an earlier note about a west wall seam, and the bracket trick meant to hide a joint. Shadow lifted his head at the word west, as if language had sense. They took rope lamps and patience back to the crater, eased the hatch, and descended. The bunker breathed them in with chill that carried iron on its tongue. Concrete made talk sound nearer than it was. Dust turned each step into a visible decision. Nora set the journal on the desk, aligned the compass to the room, and paced 20 north from the corner, then 6 east, counting under her breath, checking spacing against formwork lines and anchor bolts. Caleb joined her at the west wall and pressed his palm to the concrete that kept the day's temperature like a grudge. Shadow mapped the base with his nose, paused and set a paw on a spot that looked ordinary, until Caleb tapped there and heard a higher note return. Again he said. Shadow touched the same patch, tail level, and body carefully, attention refined to the currents people miss. Nora marked a graphite X and underlined a warning. Thomas had written 3 pages earlier. M's appetite grows with secrecy. Use locks, not trust. Greed phrased as arithmetic. Wind slid over the hatch above like a hand testing seams. Nora steadied the lamp while Caleb traced the faint ellipse of a skim coat. The thin blade kissed grit. A line widened where solid should have refused. He stopped. Nora heard the stop. You're not ready, she said, not as a challenge, as care. If this opens onto guilt, he answered, then someone I loved preferred secrecy to honor, and I am the one who breaks it. Thunder rolled through stone, more felt than heard. Nora rested the lamp on the desk. Your grandfather left obstacles, not confessions, she said. Building a lock is not the same as burying a lie. Opening it reads the choice he made. Shadow pressed his weight to Caleb's knee, calm and present. Caleb let the cold settle, until stubbornness thinned, then nodded once. Nora turned to a folded corner that indexed bracket count. 2 brackets on the west run masked a joint. The measure put their X inside a rectangle, no larger than a suitcase. Caleb worked the seam with care, trading blade for narrow chisel, and a rubber mallet, driving energy into the line rather than the wall. Dust rose, chalk fine and instantly cold. Shadow sneezed, stepped back 2 paces, and watched like a sentry. The perimeter surrendered. The panel shifted. Caleb lifted a composite mask faced with concrete, clever in weight and feel. Behind it, darkness held its breath. The recess was dry, precise, ledger neat. On its floor lay a parcel wrapped in oiled cloth. Twine knotted and sealed with a toy compass pressed into wax. Thomas had signed with direction. Caleb reached, hesitated, and recognized the returning ache under his sternum, the one that lives where respect meets injury. Nora did not press. Rain ticked on the hatch, then grew heavier, ladders carrying sound down the shaft. The room seemed smaller now that a secret had given up space. Caleb set the parcel on the desk, cut the seal with the blade, and untied the knot with care. Learned from wires he hoped were harmless. Inside, legal folders lay in clean order, tabs dated 65 through 67, each pencil marked MN. Beneath them waited an envelope, addressed to no one in Thomas's steady hand. Caleb read aloud in low cadence. L argues for disclosure, M argues for speed. I choose delay. An asset is kept here to keep a thief from the paperwork. Return the value to the rightful hands when proof is presented. Until then, hold. Nora closed her eyes for a beat, something unknotted by plain words. She opened the first fold. Stock certificates in Elias Navarro's name sat in sleeves. Signatures original, corners crisp. Deeds followed, tied to parcels far from this bluff. A memo noted a power of attorney revoked under pressure, and a banker who would speak only with counsel. Thomas's marginal notes did not accuse Leonard directly. They circled temptation in tides. M. Presses when questions sleep. Luz seeks comfort unless guided. Keep the boy away. Caleb braced both hands on the desk, and felt steel carry the bunker's chill into bone. Thomas had wanted him clear of this, and still he stood inside the room, reading instructions that crossed decades to land on his hands. Nora spoke for rooms that guard echoes. If we back out now, Victor writes his ending. If we move forward, we need light and law. Caleb nodded toward the latter. The sheriff will put this into the record. We log, photograph, seal, and transport. Nora rewrapped the folders and pressed the broken seal into the cloth like a marker. Shadow nosed the empty cavity, then turned to face the ladder, instincts leaning toward tires that had not yet touched gravel. Thunder spaced itself in lazy measures that promised long weather. The bunker felt tighter, Not for lack of air, for lack of doubt. They had crossed from wondering to knowing, and that boundary chills its own way. Caleb slid the panel home, smoothed the seam, and lifted the parcel, envelope and journal. They climbed, Shadow first, Nora second, Caleb last, lamps throwing ovals over rungs slick with mist. Wind shoved the hatch when they reached daylight. The house took them back with a groan that only old timber understands. Nora laid the parcel on the table, and photographed corners, tabs, stamps, pencil marks, the seal's torn face, each image time-stamped and backed up to her drive. Caleb watched the drive darken into a ribbon, while lightning stitched thin seams across the horizon. The dreaded choice began to change shape inside him, turning from fear into instruction, a feeling he knew from nights when stillness would have cost lives. Whatever Thomas failed to say, the paper he left said enough in quiet script, and the room held that paradox without flinching. They verified counts, matched dates to entries, and cross-checked the coordinate slip with bracket spacing, to affirm they had opened cavity 1. A solitary brad, near the floor, suggested a second cache farther west, the nail head bright where dust had never settled. Not tonight, Caleb said. Nora agreed. Evidence already sufficed. Rain hardened into cords that hissed along the bluff, while Caleb hauled a sledge from the shed and dropped through the hatch with a resolve that felt signed in bone. The bunker received him with an air of iron and long-kept paper. Nora followed with the lamp low, its cone sliding across the west wall, where bracket counts and seams refused to look innocent. Shadow posted by the ladder, chest tight with attention, ears toward the rain, combing the rim. Caleb set his palm to concrete, measuring distance from the corner, hearing that thinner note their knuckles had found, then stepped back and swung. The first blow thudded up his arms. Dust bloomed bitter on the tongue. He swung again, weight clean through hips and shoulders. A fissure ran from seam to bracket hole. He hit the line until the wall changed voice, from stubborn to hollow. Nora kept the rhythm honest with short cues, count and angle, no rush. Thunder paced overhead, and rain hammered the hatch so hard each pause felt earned. The skim coat broke. He levered out a section and exposed a cavity, edges precise, interior dry, a rectangle wrapped in oilcloth scuffed to leather brown. He cleared the lip, lifted, and found beneath the outer layer a leather briefcase, brass snaps green, handle rigid, a rubbed tag with 2 letters that steadied in light, EN. He set the case on the desk, freed the stubborn clasp with a driver, and eased the lid. Paper lay ordered to please a meticulous mind, stock certificates, deeds, affidavits, each repeating a single name, Elias Navarro. On top sat a reel-to-reel tape in a cardboard sleeve, dated late '66, penciled with one word in the journal's hand, confession. Shadow pressed against his leg. The radio chassis under the desk, casing gone but tubes intact, waited beside a coiled cloth cord. Caleb checked the breaker, seated the plug, watched filaments wake, and cleaned the tape path with a cloth. He set the reel, threaded the leader, and nudged the motor, until the mechanism remembered motion. The speaker rattled, then found itself. He kept the volume just above the rain. His smoothed, and a man exhaled near the microphone, a presence made of air and regret. Leonard Blake named himself, gave the date and room, listed partners by name, and began without ornament. He spoke of an opportunity born from contracts that had outlived purpose. Money moved through shells into instruments that passed a glance so long as nobody opened the boxes. Elias Navarro, the fourth man, had funded early buys and demanded clean paper. Marcus Hale grew impatient with oversight. Thomas Morrow argued for daylight. Leonard paused, breath-catching, then continued like a witness with no court left. He described a winter night, fog over rock, the hatch newly set, a transfer scheduled. Elias balked when he saw the conduit renamed, without his consent. Words sharpened. Marcus carried a pistol because fear needs props. Thomas took it, chambered, and handed it back. 3 beats of recorded silence. Then Leonard said, "The sentence no grandson expects." They killed Elias in the room above the bunker, and dragged him to the water, weighted him with a chain from the old winch. He did not describe the body. He described his own hands not stopping, signatures that moved wealth from truth to shadow, documents hidden until he could grow a conscience. He said he failed fast enough. Nora stood very still, fingers pale on a chair back. Shadow leaned harder into Caleb's knee. The room seemed to tilt in a slow sea. Rain needled the hatch, and the tape whispered with line noise. Leonard named bank boxes, code marks, and a plan to return title when proof could be made without destroying families. He apologized to a woman he would not name. He asked whoever opened the case to deliver everything bearing Elias's name to his blood. Caleb set his forearms on the desk so his hands would not shake. The way Leonard said Thomas sounded like a ledger tagged with shame. The reel clicked at the tail, and spun the lead. Caleb stopped the motor, and left the tape threaded as if reversing could undo nothing. Nora spoke his name once. Not a question. Shadow nosed his wrist. Cold held in concrete settled under his sternum, heavier than air. Thunder rolled east. Rain pressed hard enough to prick the back of his neck. He pulled the lid to a safer angle, weighted it with a brick, and wiped the rungs. We document, Nora said in an even tone, because one voice must be steady. We call Reed, preserve the chain, stop the rumor. Caleb nodded and found the nod landing on something steadier than despair. Betrayal had weight, but clarity carried its own strength. He stacked certificates, slid deeds into a folder, and labeled envelopes with a method that would stand under any light. Nora photographed layers, dates on frame, angles consistent, and the tape counter note. Shadow paced once, then sat between them like a hinge that kept the room aligned. Hairline cracks webbed the broken skin, where anger ran ahead of care. Caleb wetted dust so grit stayed down. Above, the storm shifted gear. Surf punched ledges in timed blows that shook fine powder from the rafters. The bunker held, the past finally spoken, stopped pretending to be mute. Caleb read one deed twice, because the county name anchored a family story about a bad harvest, and a cousin who vanished after a sale. Threads ran both ways once you pulled a knot. He set the deed with the rest and closed the case. He labeled the tape sleeve and wrapped it in felt drawn from a drawer. He powered down, watching tubes dim to amber. They climbed in silence, each rung a step out of a childhood that no longer fit. Rain broke across their faces when they surfed. Lightning stitched offshore. The house looked older and somehow more honest. Caleb placed the briefcase on the kitchen table, locked the hatch with the new ring bolt, and dialed the sheriff. He used exact words, the kind that travel clean. He ended the call and met Nora's eyes while the bell ticked once in a tired arc. Outside, the storm kept time. Inside, the truth chose shape. Shadow lay at their feet, a steady witness. The night had fewer secrets now, and the ones remaining would not stay buried long. He stood at the sink and let cold water run over dust-stained hands, until sensation returned, then dried them on a towel that smelled of salt and turpentine. Ordinary scents, anchoring lives not built on secrecy. Nora opened the journal to the page where Thomas wrote risk accepted by silence, and set it beside the briefcase, so the two objects argued in plain view. Shadow lifted, circled once, and settled facing the door, as if he understood tired footsteps might come back down the drive before the weather eased. Caleb looked toward the hatch, and heard rain pelting its lip in bright bursts, a Morse code that spelled now in every text. He breathed once, deliberate, and let resolve join grief. Then he said, "We finish what they started, but we finish it clean." Dusk bled into a metallic bruise over the bluff, as wind shoved rain sideways, and the bell ticked the door like a nervous metronome. Headlights slit the trees. The black SUV returned with a second truck close behind. Victor Hale climbed out wearing a field jacket and entitlement. 4 men fanning into positions learned outside courthouses and bars. Caleb stood on the porch with Nora behind the window, lights bright, phone ready, the briefcase hidden beneath the attic. Eve, the tape wrapped in felt inside a bread box, the journal open to a page. A judge would appreciate. Shadow fixed on the path, ears knifed forward, a growl building low and restrained. Victor stopped by the flattened fence. "We can finish this without drama," he called. "Bring me the case, the reels and the deeds. You'll get a receipt. You'll get a door shut in your face." Caleb answered. Nora stepped onto the porch, hood up, voice even. "The sheriff has our statement," she said. If you have a claim, file it. Victor glanced at the crater and then at the rope. Or we go see what you're guarding, he said, sending two men toward the pit while another lingered near the steps. Shadow slid forward and froze, teeth bared. Call him off, the man said, hand twitching toward his jacket. Move again, Caleb said, and he decides faster than you do. Victor raised a calming palm and smiled as if magnanimity proved ownership. You think wind and a pet make law, he said. Paper makes law, and paper says our asset sat under your dirt. Paper also says murder bled into that paper, Nora said. You want due process, wait for it. Victor's expression cooled. Take us down, he said. We'll confirm the contents together. Caleb considered leverage. The bunker was a funnel, a place where sound punished bravado. He nodded and led them to the hatch. Ladder's slick, he said. Hands on the rail. Try to rush, and the wall explains physics. One man snorted and started down. Victor followed. Caleb went last with a lamp, and the pump gun he kept unloaded until reasons appeared. The bunker drew them into cold air that tasted like iron and paper. Rain hammered the lid. Nora stayed above. Line open to dispatch, giving names, plates, location, and the fact that uninvited visitors had entered a structure after warning. Victor turned in a slow circle as if appraising his own vault. Let's stop pretending, he said. Give me the briefcase. Caleb racked the shotgun and pointed at the floor, so the metal language carried without burning bridges. He might need. Back up, he said. Hands where I can count them. The nearer thug shrugged, reached toward the west seam, and found Caleb's warning shot hammering the ceiling. The concussion slapped concrete and ate the next second. Dust leapt. Lamps fluttered. Mouths forgot lines. Victor flinched, composed himself, and tried disdain. Felony menacing, he said. Documentation. Caleb replied, nodding toward the camera on a shelf. Witnesses. Calls logged. You walked in after being told to leave. Above, the guard by the porch grabbed Nora's sleeve. Shadow launched, hit the man in the thigh, and drove him into the mud, teeth sinking through fabric. Nora pulled free and ordered heel. The dog released and held position, lips peeled, eyes locked. She shouted down the shaft that deputies were rolling. Sirens formed out of the wind like a cord drawing tight. Victor's men twitched toward the ladder. Caleb chambered another round and leveled calm at their legs. Climb and I shoot the rung you're standing on, he said. Then gravity finishes the speech. Victor lifted his hands shoulder high. You're a loner, with a dog and a decaying house, he said. I'm the only path out of this without ruin. Nora's voice dropped into the hole like a line thrown from a lit bow. Have you ever fought for what's right, even against the odds, she asked. Because that's what's happening. Victor chose menace. Those reels belong to my father, he said. Those certificates belong to me. They belong to the man your family erased. Caleb's. You'll see his name in court. The nearer thug lunged again. Caleb shot into the floor beside his boot. Concrete spat. The man pinwheeled. The other froze and pressed himself to the wall. Rain beat a faster tattoo on the hat. Shadow held his ground above, a silent barricade with muscle and teeth. Tires shredded gravel outside. Doors slammed. Hands where I can see them. Sheriff Daniel Reed called from the rim, voice worn and certain. Caleb, 3 below, 1 topside with punctured pride. Caleb's. 2 deputies descended in sequence, flashlights cutting precise paths, shoulders set for collisions that never came. Reed followed, looked once, and seemed to read the hour from dust, posture, muzzle angle, and faces that had learned they were not as brave as payment required. Miss Hale, he said, you're trespassing after warning and interfering with an investigation. Turn around. Victor tried lawyering by volume, repeating the attorney as if volume conjured counsel. Cuffs closed with final click. The 2 hirelings folded next, wrists together, vocabulary shrinking to yes and fine. Above, Nora handed down the partnership copy, her call log, and the photograph bearing 3 men on a brighter winter. Reed glanced at the west wall, at the troweled seam, at the camera light blinking, and nodded once to Caleb, a professional acknowledgement that procedure had been honored under pressure. We'll take statements at the station, he said. Evidence stays put until the warrant lands. My deputy will sit in your driveway. Victor passed the hatch and tried to save a sliver of face. You'll regret this, he said. Courts hate vigilantes. Courts hate liars more, Nora said. Bring your filings. Rain thickened, then soft red and blue bled across wet trunks, while the convoy wound back through spruce. Shadow returned to the porch and watched the taillights drain from the trees. Caleb closed the hatch, set the bar, and checked each window. Nora leaned her back against the wall and let adrenaline bleed away. He'll post bail and try again, she said. Then we keep immaculate records and wider circles, Caleb said. They climbed to the attic, checked the eave, verified tape and deeds, then came down to the kitchen where the house smelled of salt coffee and wet wool. Lightning stitched pale seams offshore. Thunder moved seaward. The bell rested. Shadow curled on the mat, one ear cocked toward the stairwell and one toward the road. Caleb poured coffee that tasted like nails and resolve. Nora warmed her hands around the mud. The house exhaled, old timbers settling into watchfulness again. We walked straight into the story they tried to write for us and tore out the last page, she said. Tomorrow we write our own. Caleb nodded. We finish what the tape began. Clean chain, full light, names on. Outside, the surf kept speaking in slow blows against the ledge. Inside, the briefcase waited. The journal kept counsel, and the dog, satisfied for now, guarded the space where a life could start again without being haunted by what lay under the floor. The morning after the arrests broke clean and bright, as if the coastline had wrung the storm from its bones. Gulls drew slow loops over level water. The clapboard house stood quieter than Caleb had ever known it, the bell still, the rail drying in the sun. Sheriff Daniel Reed left a deputy on the road and drove the evidence to town under a chain and signature. Transcripts were logged. The reel was sealed in the county vault. Nora filed affidavits and kept copies. Caleb walked the yard with Shadow, checking gates he no longer needed, and a hatch that would soon be history. Victor posted bail and left the county line under warning, his certainty certainer than the fog creeping off the cove. 2 days later, Maria Navarro arrived, stepping from a bus with a canvas tote and a face that carried 3 generations of patience. Her grandmother had spoken the surname in a hush and never explained why their family avoided northern coasts and wood churches. Maria shook Caleb's hand, hugged Nora with the care of someone who knows professions can become armor, and sat at the kitchen table while sunlight climbed across the floor. Reed read the affidavit aloud. Caleb signed, Maria signed, in a script that looked like someone learning to trust paper again. She did not cry. She exhaled the way a long swimmer touches pure wood. Together they opened the briefcase and counted what would be returned: certificates, deeds, and the tape-certified transcript. Caleb said the estate belonged where the name said it belonged. Nora nodded. Witness and friend. Victor's counsel filed motions. The court read the tape, the agreement, the chain of custody, and the threat reports, and wrote an opinion that recognized conspiracy and consecrated restitution. The name Elias Navarro returned to town, records not as rumor but as a man whose stake had been buried under greed and clay. The tape became an exhibit, then an archive entry, not a weapon, a witness. Marcus's line would answer in civil court for schemes that outlived him. Leonard's history would be told in scholarly language, with room for failure and repair. Reed released certified copies. The originals went with a guard to a bank box registered in Maria's name alone. By week's end, the house knew it would not keep Caleb. He walked the rooms with a quiet hand, touching door frames where his grandfather had penciled height. He sold the property to a coastal conservancy that moved as patiently as lichen, an outfit that promised the field would remain field, the cliff would remain cliff, and the bunker would be sealed after the archive finished its record. Surveyors planted small flags that meant no fence would claim the ledge again. The purchase contract carried a covenant forbidding development in perpetuity. Caleb read it twice and felt relieved. On his last morning, the sea lay flat as pewter. The rope came up from the hatch. The plate settled. Crews poured a thin cap of concrete and brushed it smooth, a circle within a circle, not an erasure, a mark. Reed watched a minute, tipped his hat, and shook Caleb's hand. Nora photographed the work, cataloged coordinates, and handed a copy of her report to Maria. The 3 of them stood by the old pine stump. Maria placed her palm on the concrete and said a short prayer. Shadow trotted between the truck and the porch, reading the air. The dog had slept by the bed every night since the tape played, as if understanding that dreams carry old debris. Caleb clipped the harness, loaded a cooler, folded maps, and shut the clapboard door for the last time. Inside, the kitchen smelled of coffee and lemon oil. He locked the knob, traced the weathered paint with one finger, and turned toward the road. Nora walked with him to the gate. "You'll write," she said, asking and asserting together. "I will," he answered. "East first, then south. No schedule." She smiled and kept her boundary. "I'll be in archives and hearings," she said, "but I'll save a table by a window for when you circle back." They shook hands. Maria joined them, pressed a silver compass into Caleb's palm, and said, "For when the road offers too many turns." The conservancy crew loaded timbers. The deputy filed his last note. The wind came gently from the west. Caleb started the truck. Gravel clicked under new tires, and spruce opened to the highway. Miles later, the bluff was a thin line in the mirror, a patient shape that could hold secrets and truth equally well now that the right hands held the ledger. Through New Hampshire and into Vermont, guilt settled into a quieter thing. He stopped at a shelter to leave a donation in Elias's name, then walked shadow along a river path, where leaves clung bright and damp to their branches. The dog waded to his ankles and looked back. That night, motel lamplight rinsed cheap art in soft gold. Caleb wrote 3 letters, one to Maria, one to Reed, and one to Nora. He thanked, accounted, and promised to return when the case closed under daylight. The coast he left changed without him. The house became a caretaker's station, and a point on a trail map. A bronze plate near the stump read, "In honor of Elias Navarro, and all who return what was taken," set far enough from the lip that careless tourists could not drop phones into the ocean. Reed drove past on his ramp. Nora won a grant, and wrote a paper that treated secrecy as a geography rather than a melodrama. Maria worked with a community fund to seed scholarships for kids who study land stewardship and ethics in business. Names on checks matched names on stories. Some evenings in the Shenandoah, Caleb let the radio play and counted the ways a life can narrow without courage. War had taught him how to survive. Maine had taught him how to refuse survival without honor. The two lessons no longer argued. He learned towns by pie, the taste of different water, the pitch of locusts after sundown, and the feeling of being called sir with respect. He mailed Maria a photograph of Shadow wearing a bandana stitched with tiny compasses. Her reply came with a picture of the plaque and a clear shoreline. Honor seldom feels like triumph. It feels like steady breath after a long swim, the warmth of a dog against your leg, the Atlantic when it is too tired to roar. One evening, with crickets sandpapering the dark and the compass catching a speck of moonlight on the dash, he thought of Thomas, Leonard, Marcus and Elias, and chose to remember the last man first. He raised a glass of diner tea to a future that owed less to secrecy and more to repair. He drove on toward the Blue Ridge, and then the low country, taking back roads that curved through pasture and pine. He and Shadow built small rituals, a dawn walk before coffee, a midday stretch beside water, a pause at sunset to listen without talking. Some days he thought of the hatch, and felt only gratitude for the storm that forced the truth up into the air. Other days he pictured Elias signing his name in a bank office, and imagined the relief of watching that name restored. Wherever they stopped, he told the shortest version of the story, and let the rest live where it belonged, in record, in memory, and in better hands. If Caleb and Shadow's fight for justice moved you, join our community to uncover more stories of courage. Subscribe now, and share your thoughts below.